A year after their world had been burned to the ground, they stood on the broad concrete apron in front of the old firehouse and watched the town arrive. Frank's hand, warm and calloused, found Dorothy's. It was a gesture as familiar as breathing, a silent conversation they had been having for 54 years. People came not in a trickle, but in a slow, steady procession. They carried covered dishes and folding chairs and coolers filled with ice and soda. The scent of barbecue was already starting to ghost through the late afternoon air. A year ago, they had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a car running on fumes, and the crushing weight of betrayal. Now, the whole town stood before them, not for charity, but for a celebration. A celebration of the impossible thing they had built from the ruins. It was a home forged from disgrace, a community born of abandonment. Dorothy watched as Earl Hobbs, the hardware store owner who had been their first believer, directed a teenager on where to set up a long folding table. She saw Maya, her own belly now round and full with new life, laughing with the pastor's wife. She saw Leo, the boy who had arrived broken, confidently stringing lights across the massive open bay doors, his face bright with purpose. Frank squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. This was real. This was theirs. This foundation was unshakable. But to understand how a discarded old couple and a derelict brick building could become the heart of a town, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day their world ended, with a pen and a smile. The house on Maple Street had been their only home. Frank laid the foundation himself, or so he liked to claim, though the truth was he'd only been an apprentice carpenter on the crew that framed it in 1968. But over the decades, he had made it his own. He built the bookshelves in the living room, solid oak things that bowed slightly under the weight of Dorothy's history books and novels. He built the breakfast nook where they ate every morning, the sun slanting in through the window. He'd replaced himself just 5 years prior. He built the workbench in the garage that was his sanctuary, a place of sawdust and patient creation. Dorothy, for her part, had filled the house with life. She was a bookkeeper by trade, a woman who understood that life was a ledger of countless small, important entries. She tracked the mortgage payments until they were gone, a moment marked not with a party, but with a quiet, satisfied sigh and a single, neat line drawn in her account book. She recorded the height of their children, Mark and Susan, in pencil marks on a doorframe. She managed the garden, a riot of tomatoes and green beans in the summer, her own small rebellion against the price of groceries. Their life was a testament to quiet competence. They were not wealthy, but they were secure. They had paid their dues, raised their children, and eased into a retirement that was meant to be a long, slow exhale. Frank still tinkered in his garage, fixing neighbors' wobbly chairs for a plate of cookies. Dorothy still volunteered at the library, helping people navigate the tax forms that had been her bread and butter for 40 years. They were 76 and 74, and they believed they had accounted for everything. That was their first mistake. Mark arrived on a Tuesday. He wore a suit that cost more than their monthly food budget and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was their son, their ambitious boy, the one who had left their small town for the city and had, by all accounts, succeeded. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of urgent importance. "Mom, Dad," he'd said, spreading papers across the polished surface of the dining table Frank had refinished. "We need to talk about the future." The future, as Mark explained it, was a landscape of treacherous possibilities. Long-term care costs, predatory medical liens. The government, he said, could take the house. Everything they had worked for could be wiped out by a single prolonged illness. His words were slick with concern, each one a carefully chosen tool to pry loose their sense of security. "It's just estate planning," he'd assured them. "A simple legal maneuver. We put the house in a trust, with me and Susan as trustees. It protects the asset. It's what everyone does." Dorothy, the bookkeeper, felt a flicker of unease. The columns didn't add up. She looked at the papers at the dense blocks of legal text. "Can we have our lawyer look at this, Mark?" Mark's smile tightened. "Mom, I am a lawyer." "Well, almost. And the firm I work for drafted these. They're the best. A local guy would just charge you a fortune to tell you the same thing. This is about protecting you, protecting everything you've built. He framed it as a gift, an act of filial devotion. Frank, who trusted his son implicitly, saw no reason to doubt him. He saw the logic. He saw the love. He picked up the pen. Dorothy, her unease overruled by her husband's trust and her son's insistence, watched Frank sign. Then, with a hand that felt strangely heavy, she signed her name beside his, the name that had been on the deed for 51 years. The ink was barely dry when the second part of the plan was revealed. "There's one more thing," Mark said, gathering the papers. "Susan and I have been talking. This house, it needs some work. A few updates to make it safer for you. New wiring, maybe a walk-in shower. We found a great contractor." Susan, their daughter, arrived then, as if on cue. She was softer than Mark, her guilt making her solicitous. She carried a lemon cake, Dorothy's favorite. "And while the work is being done," Susan chirped, "we found the most wonderful place for you to stay. It's called the Willows. It's a senior apartment, just for a trial run. A little vacation. You won't have to lift a finger." It was a whirlwind. Before they could truly process it, they were packing suitcases. Just a few things for a month, they were told. Mark and Susan were models of efficiency, a pincer movement of cheerful helpfulness. They were bundled into Mark's luxury sedan, the familiar scent of their own home, lemon polish and old wood, replaced by the sterile smell of new leather. The Willows was clean and beige and utterly soulless. The apartment was small, furnished with impersonal hotel-grade furniture. "Isn't it great?" Susan said, her voice too bright. They stood in the middle of the small living room, two aging trees abruptly uprooted and set down in a plastic pot. Mark placed their suitcases on the floor. "We'll take your car back to the house to keep it safe in the garage," Mark said, holding out his hand for the keys. "And your phones, the reception here isn't great, and there's a landline right here if you need anything. We'll bring them back, all charged up, when we come check on you." It was the final, gentle snip of the last thread connecting them to their world. Frank handed over the keys. Dorothy gave him her phone. They were acts of trust, the kind of trust built over a lifetime. "We'll be back on Friday to take you to dinner," Susan promised, kissing them both on the cheek. Her skin was cool. Mark clapped his father on the shoulder. "You guys just relax. You've earned it." Then they were gone. Frank and Dorothy stood in the silent, beige room. The air hummed with the sound of a refrigerator they didn't own. Frank walked to the window and looked out at a parking lot filled with cars that were not his. "A vacation," he said, his voice flat. Dorothy did not reply. She was a bookkeeper. She had just watched the two most important assets of her life walk out the door, and she had this sickening feeling that she had just co-signed the withdrawal slip. Friday came and went. No call, no visit. The landline remained silent. Dorothy called the numbers Mark and Susan had left on a neat little card on the counter. Mark's went to a crisp voicemail. Susan's rang and rang until it was disconnected. They waited. They waited through the weekend, eating the food Susan had stocked in the small refrigerator. They waited through the next week, the silence in the beige apartment growing louder each day. Frank paced the small space, his big hands clenching and unclenching, a carpenter with nothing to build, nothing to fix. Dorothy sat in a hardback chair, the ledger in her mind open to a page she couldn't balance. They didn't call. They never called. On the 29th day, a polite young woman from the management office knocked on their door. She had a clipboard. She informed them that the lease, which had been paid for 1 month only, was expiring in 2 days. She asked if they would be renewing. The floor did not fall away. The walls did not crumble. The world simply tilted silently and irrevocably on its axis. "There must be a mistake," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. "Our children, they arranged this." The young woman offered a sympathetic, professional smile. "I'm sorry, sir. The arrangement was for 1 month." Not with a flicker of unease, but with the cold, hard certainty of a final, brutal calculation. The papers, the apartment, the car keys, the phones, they were not individual entries. They were a sequence, a plan. They had not been moved. They had been removed. They packed their 2 suitcases in silence. On the last day, they walked out of the Willows, leaving the key on the counter. They stood on the curb, 2 respectable, elderly people, and waited for a taxi they had called from a lobby. They had a few $1,000s in a joint savings account, an emergency fund Dorothy had always maintained. The emergency had arrived. The taxi took them back to Maple Street, back to their home. There was a sign on the lawn, a bright, cheerful, professional sign. For sale. A different family's car was in their driveway. A woman they had never seen before was watering the petunias Dorothy had planted. She looked up and smiled at them, a friendly, unknowing smile, as they stood on the sidewalk, their suitcases like anchors at their feet. Frank took a step forward, a sound of raw disbelief in his throat. But Dorothy put a hand on his arm. Her touch was firm, grounding. "No, Frank," she said, her voice quiet but steel-hard. "It's not our house anymore." The ledger was balanced. On one side, a lifetime of work and love. On the other, a signature. The result was 0. They had been subtracted from their own lives. They spent the first night in a motel off the highway, a place that smelled of stale smoke and despair. The room was lit by the angry, blinking red of the vacancy sign outside their window. Frank sat on the edge of one of the twin beds, his broad shoulders slumped. He looked older than she had ever seen him, as if the 51 years in their home had been stripped away in a single afternoon, leaving only the raw, brittle frame of a 76-year-old man. "I don't understand," he said, over and over. "Mark, Susie." Dorothy understood all too well. She understood the cold arithmetic of greed. Mark had wanted the asset, not the parents attached to it. The house, sold quickly in a hot market, was a significant windfall, far more than the cost of a single month in a beige apartment. Susan, weaker and more easily led, had been a willing accomplice, sweetened, no doubt, with a share of the profits. She didn't say any of this to Frank. He was a builder. He saw the world in terms of what could be constructed, what could be fixed. He could not comprehend a demolition so total, so personal. For now, she would shield him from the full, ugly architecture of the betrayal. The next day, they went to the police. The officer behind the desk was young, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He listened to their story, his pen hovering over a form. "So, you signed the papers over to them?" he asked. "Yes, but we were misled," Dorothy explained, trying to keep her voice steady. The officer sighed. "Ma'am, if you sign the documents, it's a civil matter, not a criminal one. You need to hire a lawyer." A lawyer. The irony was a bitter pill. They had been undone by a lawyer, and now their only recourse was to hire another. With what money? The few thousand in their emergency fund would be consumed by a retainer in a matter of hours. They were trapped in a paradox of the powerless. To get justice, you needed money, but they had no money because of the injustice. The days bled into a week. The week into 2. They moved from the first motel to a cheaper one, then to one that was cheaper still. Each move was a step down, a shedding of another layer of dignity. The fluorescent lights of the motel rooms flickered over the same grim tableau. 2 suitcases, 2 aging people, and a silence thick with unspoken fear. Their savings account, once a source of quiet pride, was now a dwindling clock, each withdrawal a tick toward homelessness. They bought a car, a 20-year-old sedan that rattled and coughed, for $900 cash. It was at least a possession, a container for their shrinking world. There were days they didn't get a motel room. They would park in the 24-hour lot of a supermarket. Frank in the driver's seat, Dorothy in the passenger's, the seats reclined as far as they would go. They would watch families come and go, carts piled high with groceries, and feel utterly invisible. They were ghosts haunting the periphery of a world that had no place for them. One night, parked behind a darkened diner, Frank finally broke. It wasn't a loud, angry collapse, but a quiet, terrifying implosion. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, his big, capable hands lying useless in his lap. "I can't fix this, Dottie," he whispered into the stale air of the car. "I don't know how to fix this." It was the lowest point, the absolute bottom. They were no longer Frank and Dorothy, the couple from Maple Street. They were just 2 old people in a failing car, with a few $100s left to their name, parked in the dark. Discarded. Forgotten. Dorothy looked at the man she had loved for more than half a century, at the profile of his defeat. Something inside her, something that had been dormant and numbed by shock, finally sparked. It was not hope. It was defiance. She was a bookkeeper. Her entire life had been about finding order in chaos, about balancing the books. Her life was currently, wildly, in the red. She could not accept that. She would not accept that. "We're not done, Frank," she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper in the darkness. "The book is not closed." The next morning, she did not allow them to wallow. She directed Frank to the public library. It was a place she understood, a place of order and information. While Frank dozed in the car, Dorothy walked into the cool, quiet building. She didn't go to the fiction section. She went to the public access computers. For years, her job had been to navigate complex systems of numbers and regulations. Now, she turned that methodical mind to the problem of their own survival. She had two dwindling assets, a small amount of cash and a husband who could build anything. She needed a liability to turn into an asset. She started with the county's website. She bypassed the regular real estate listings, the ones filled with smiling agents and charming bungalows they could never afford. She went deeper into the obscure corners of the site. Foreclosures, tax liens, condemned properties. She was looking for a rounding error, a forgotten entry in the county's vast ledger. For hours, she clicked and scrolled, her eyes tracing lines of digital text. She saw dilapidated farmhouses with collapsing roofs, commercial buildings riddled with code violations, empty lots in forgotten subdivisions. Everything was either too expensive or too far gone. Her back ached. Her eyes burned from the screen's glow. She was about to give up, to concede that this too was a dead end. But then she saw it, tucked away in a list of surplus municipal properties scheduled for auction. Item number 734. Former Township Firehouse number 3. The description was brutally concise. Brick and mortar construction, circa 1952. Decommissioned 1994. Property sold as is, where is. Known structural issues. Significant water damage. Asbestos abatement required. County assumes no liability. There was a single, grainy photograph. It showed a squat, two-story brick building, its windows boarded up, weeds choking the concrete apron where fire trucks once sat gleaming. The big bay doors were sealed with rust-streaked sheets of corrugated metal. It was a picture of civic failure, a monument to decay. Most people would have seen a ruin, a liability. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, saw something else. She saw the numbers. Starting bid, $100. It was a typo. It had to be. But she clicked further, reading the auction notes. The county had tried to sell it twice before. No vides. The cost of demolition was estimated to be over $100,000. The cost of bringing it up to code for any commercial use was astronomical. It wasn't an asset to the county. It was a wound. They weren't trying to make money. They were trying to stop the bleeding. They just wanted it off the books. Dorothy's heart began to beat a little faster. She looked at the grainy photo again. She ignored the boarded windows and the weeds. She looked at the bones. Brick and mortar. A solid foundation. A roof, however damaged. It was a structure. It was 4 walls. She printed the single page of information. She walked out of the library, the paper clutched in her hand like a winning lottery ticket. She got back into the passenger seat of the old car. Frank was still asleep, his face etched with worry even in slumber. She touched his shoulder gently. He startled awake. "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. She didn't say anything. She just handed him the paper. He held it in his big, calloused hands, the hands that had built bookshelves and breakfast nooks. He stared at the picture. He read the description. His expression didn't change. "It's a wreck, Dottie," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of their reality. "A condemned wreck." "It's a building, Frank," she replied, her voice steady. "It's made of brick. It has a foundation. We have less than $1,000 left." "The starting bid is $1, she said. She pointed to the line on the paper. "They're not selling it. They're giving it away." He looked from the paper to her, and for the first time he saw the spark in her eyes, the defiance, the flicker of the woman who balanced the books, who made things add up, who refused to accept a negative balance. What were we supposed to do with it? He asked, but the question held less despair and more genuine curiosity. We live in it, Dorothy said, the words simple, absurd, and yet utterly serious. We buy it. We own it. It will be ours, Frank. No one can take it from us. No one can sell it out from under us. We will have a roof over our heads. Our own roof. Frank was silent for a long time. He looked at the photograph of the derelict building. He looked at his own hands, worn and empty. He thought of the beige apartment, the motel rooms, the cold vinyl of the car seat. He thought of being a ghost, invisible to the world. A ruin was better than being a ghost. A ruin could be rebuilt. He looked at his wife. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were clear. She was not asking. She was stating a fact. This was the next entry in their ledger. It's still standing, she said softly, as if to herself. Frank took a slow, deep breath. He folded the piece of paper neatly and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He put the key in the ignition and started the rattling engine. I'm driving us there, he said. The Firehouse was worse in person. The grainy photograph had been kind. Weeds, thick as a man's thumb, had fractured the concrete out front. The boards over the windows were rotting, and the wind whistled through the gaps with a mournful sound. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp, decay, and pigeons. It was not a building waiting for a second chance. It was a building waiting to die. They walked the perimeter. Frank ran his hand over the brickwork. Solid. He peered through a crack in the boards covering a side window. He could see only darkness. The online auction was in 2 days. It was conducted through the county's clunky website, and Dorothy handled it from another library computer. She registered them as bidders. She entered their information. When the auction for item number 734 went live, she placed a bid for $1. For 10 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The screen just showed their bid as the high bid. Dorothy imagined wealthy developers, investors, anyone swooping in at the last second. But no one did. Why would they? It was a toxic asset, a money pit. The auction closed. A line of text appeared on the screen. Winning bid, $100. Bidder D. Miller. Dorothy stared. She had just bought a building for the price of candy bar. The administrative fees and title transfer costs came to $6.42. She paid them online with her debit card. It was done. They owned a Firehouse. The last of their savings were gone, spent on the filing fees and a few groceries, but they owned a piece of dirt. They owned a roof. They drove back to the Firehouse that afternoon. Frank had the receipt from accounting. It was their deed. He got out of the car and walked to the massive, rusted metal sheets that sealed the main bay. There was a smaller access door cut into one of them, secured by a heavy, corroded padlock. From the trunk of their old car, Frank retrieved his toolbox. It was a fraction of what he once had, just the essential hand tools he'd had the foresight to grab from his garage. He selected a heavy hammer and a pry bar. He struck the padlock once. A clang of metal on metal, loud in the afternoon quiet. He struck it again, and again. The rust fought him. The decay fought him. But Frank was a carpenter. He understood leverage and force. With a final, groaning shriek of tortured metal, the hasp broke. He pulled the small door open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over them. It smelled of a decade of neglect. Frank paused, then stepped across the threshold into the darkness. Dorothy followed. The inside was cavernous. The main bay was a vast, echoing space of concrete and shadow. Light filtered in through the grimy upper windows, illuminating swirling dust motes. The floor was littered with debris, rotted wood, fallen plaster, and the skeletal remains of unfortunate birds. In the far corner, a spiral staircase led to the second floor. It was a disaster. It was overwhelming. It was theirs. Frank didn't say a word. He walked back to the car, retrieved a single, warped sheet of plywood he had salvaged from a construction site dumpster, and his hammer and a handful of nails. He went to the nearest broken window on the ground floor, a gaping hole that let in the wind and the rain. Methodically, He pulled out the shards of broken glass. He measured the opening with his eyes. He used his handsaw to cut the plywood to size. And then, with firm, rhythmic blows of his hammer, he nailed the board into place. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Each sound was an act of reclamation. Each nail was a declaration of intent. He was not just boarding up a window. He was making a stand. He was a builder, and he had something to build. When he was done, the small corner of the vast room was slightly darker, slightly less drafty. It was a tiny victory in a war against entropy, but it was a victory. He turned to Dorothy, his face streaked with grime, his expression grim but resolute. "It's a start," he said. That night, they slept in their new home. They cleared a small patch of the concrete floor. They laid down the thin blankets from the car. Dorothy used her purse as a pillow. The concrete was cold and hard, leaching warmth from their bodies. The wind howled outside. Sometime in the night, a rat skittered somewhere in the darkness. It was the best night's sleep Dorothy had had in a month. The next day, the real work began. Frank, with the methodical patience of a man who had spent a lifetime working with his hands, started by imposing order. He designated one corner as their living space. He swept it clean of debris, the sound of his broom scraping against the concrete a comforting rhythm. He used salvage boards to create a low partition, a symbolic wall that separated their small island of habitation from a sea of decay. Dorothy took on the role she knew best, management. Their finances were non-existent. They had $43 left. She started a new ledger, a small, cheap notebook from the grocery store. On the first page, she wrote Firehouse number 3. The first entry under expenses was $642. County fees, the income column was starkly, terrifyingly blank. Their survival depended on scavenging. Dorothy became an expert urban forager. She learned the trash collection schedules of local businesses. The grocery store threw out perfectly edible produce that was slightly bruised. The lumberyard had a scrap pile. The appliance store left crating and pallets out back. Her daily walks were not idle strolls. They were expeditions for resources. Frank needed more than scraps. He needed nails. He needed screws. He needed a sheet of tar paper to patch the most egregious leak in the roof directly over their corner. He took the last $20 from Dorothy, his pride warring with the grim necessity. He drove the rattling sedan to the local hardware store, a place called Hobbs Hardware. The man behind the counter was built like a retired refrigerator, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of wood and left out in the rain. A name tag read, Earl Hobbs, Prop. Frank laid his meager items on the counter. A box of nails. A roll of tar paper. Earl eyed him, then the items. "Fixin' a leak." "Something like that," Frank said. "You're the fella bought the old Firehouse, ain't you?" Earl asked. News traveled fast in a small town. Frank just nodded. Earl leaned forward, his forearms thick on the counter. "Son, that place ain't got a leak. That place is a leak. You're putting a Band-Aid on a corpse." "It's the roof over my head," Frank said, his voice quiet, devoid of self-pity. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken history. Earl looked at Frank, really looked at him. He saw the worn-out work shirt, the clean but frayed collar. He saw the hands of a man who knew tools. He saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the stubborn set of his jaw. Earl was a man of the same generation, a man who understood the language of work and quiet dignity. He grunted. He pushed the nails and the tar paper back toward Frank. "That ain't gonna do it. You need roofing cement. You need flashing. You need more than one roll of paper." "This is what I can afford," Frank said. Earl was silent for a moment. He tapped a thick finger on the counter. "My father started this store with a handshake loan from the bank president." A different time, he looked Frank square in the eye. "I'll open an account for you. A line of credit. You get what you need. You're a carpenter, right? I can see it in your hands. A carpenter's got to work." Frank was stunned into silence. He hadn't asked for charity. He would never ask for charity. "It's not charity," Earl said, as if reading his mind. "It's a professional courtesy. You pay me when you can. Just don't make me look like a fool." Frank found his voice. "I won't." "Good," Earl grunted. "Now, let's get you the right stuff for that roof." Frank walked out of Hobbs Hardware with $100 worth of materials and a $0 receipt. It was more than supplies. It was a lifeline. It was the first act of kindness they had received since their world had imploded. It was validation. Someone saw him not as a vagrant old man, but as a carpenter. When he got back to the firehouse, he didn't tell Dorothy what had happened right away. He just climbed the rickety ladder to the flat roof and got to work. Dorothy watched him from below, a dark figure moving against the gray sky, patching the wound in their new home. That night it rained, a cold, driving autumn rain. They sat on their blankets in their corner of the firehouse, listening. The building was a symphony of drips. Plink, plunk, splat. But over their heads it was silent. The patch had held. Frank finally told her about Earl. He handed her the receipt, the one that showed the long list of items and the balance due of 0. Dorothy looked at it, then at her husband. Tears welled in her eyes for the first time in weeks. Not tears of sorrow, but of a desperate, overwhelming gratitude. She made a new entry in her ledger, in the income column. It didn't feel right, but it was the only place for it. Credit, Hobbs Hardware, she wrote. And beside it, in parentheses, she added, kindness. The small victory over the leak, coupled with Earl's trust, shifted something in them. The project no longer felt like a desperate act of survival. It felt like construction. Frank's work took on a new energy. He worked from dawn until dusk, his movements fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just patching. He was building. He framed out a small, proper room in their corner, using salvaged 2x4s. He insulated it with foam sheets he found behind a furniture store. He found a discarded but intact window in an alley and painstakingly installed it, letting clean, clear light into their space for the first time. It became their bedroom, a sanctuary of 100 square feet within the cavernous ruin. Next, he tackled the most critical system, heat. Winter was coming. The firehouse had an old, cast-iron wood-burning stove in what used to be the station's common area, a rusty behemoth that hadn't been fired in 30 years. The flue was choked with nests and debris. Frank spent 2 days on the roof with a set of borrowed chimney brushes from Earl, clearing the blockage. He repaired the cracked fire bricks inside with high-temperature cement. Their first fire was a momentous occasion. Frank stacked the stove with dry, salvaged pallet wood. He struck a match. The kindling caught, and with a low whoosh, the stove drew air for the first time in a generation. A plume of white smoke rose from the chimney into the crisp autumn sky, a signal to the world that the building was no longer dead. That night, they huddled near the growing warmth, the first real, deep warmth they had felt in months. The cold of the concrete was finally beaten back. Their story, and the smoke from their chimney, began to drift through the town. They were a curiosity, the old couple who bought the ruin. People would slow their cars as they drove by, staring at the impossible sight of life in the derelict building. One afternoon, a pickup truck pulled up. A man got out, left 2 old but clean wool blankets on the steps, and drove away without a word. A few days later, a woman left a cardboard box filled with canned goods and a loaf of homemade bread. These were not acts of pity. They were quiet acknowledgments, gestures of support from a town that respected grit. Dorothy recorded each one in her ledger. 2 wool blankets, donation. Canned goods, donation. The income column was growing, but not with money. It was being filled with the currency of community. The first person to breach their solitude arrived on a cold November evening. They heard a hesitant knock on the main door. Frank opened it to find a young woman standing there, no older than 20. She was clutching a thin jacket around herself, her face pale with fear and exhaustion. Her belly was swollen with the unmistakable curve of pregnancy. I heard about this place, she stammered, her eyes wide as she peered into the vast, dimly lit space. I heard you were helping people. They weren't. They were just trying to survive. But Dorothy looked at the girl's terrified face, at the desperation in her eyes, and saw a reflection of their own recent past. The invisibility, the fear. Coming out of the cold, Dorothy said, her voice gentle. Her name was Maya. She had been living with her boyfriend, and when she told him she was pregnant, he had become violent. She had fled with nothing but her purse and the clothes she was wearing. She had been sleeping in a bus station for 2 nights. She had nowhere else to go. Frank and Dorothy looked at each other. There was no discussion. There was no debate. They had a roof. They had warmth. They had a single, finished 100-square-foot room. "You can stay with me," Dorothy said, gesturing to their small sanctuary. "Frank can sleep on the cot out here by the stove." Frank didn't hesitate. He immediately started setting up a temporary bed for himself outside their room. That night, Maya slept in a real bed for the first time in days, safe and warm. Her arrival changed the equation. The project was no longer just for them. The next morning, Frank began work on a new room. He sectioned off another corner of the main bay, adjacent to theirs. For the baby, he said simply. He worked with a fierce new determination, framing walls, looking for another window to salvage. Maya, her strength slowly returning, insisted on helping. She couldn't lift heavy things, but she could pull nails from old boards. She could organize tools. She could help Dorothy with their meager cooking. She brought a quiet, youthful energy to the dusty space. A week later, a second knock. This time it was a boy, maybe 17, with purple hair and a bruised cheek. His name was Leo. His parents had kicked him out when they found out he had a boyfriend. He had been couch surfing, but his welcome had run out. He was smart, tech-savvy, and utterly lost. Again, there was no hesitation. He was given a corner and a pile of blankets near the stove. Leo, grateful and eager to contribute, noticed the tangle of ancient wiring in the building. "I think I can get some of the lights to work," he said, "if we can get the main breaker turned on." It was a dangerous proposition. The building's power had been cut for decades. But Leo had a knack for it. He spent days tracing wires, studying the old schematics he found in a dusty office. With a combination of his own knowledge and a few cautious phone calls to an electrician friend, he figured out how to isolate a single, safe circuit. With a contribution from the church pastor, who had heard their story, they paid the fee to have the power company reconnect the service. The moment Leo flipped the main breaker was tense. Nothing exploded. Nothing sparked. And then, he flipped a single switch on the wall. A string of 4 bare bulbs hanging from the high ceiling of the main bay flickered to life, casting a steady, yellow glow over the concrete floor. It was like the sun rising indoors. They all stood there, Frank, Dorothy, Maya, and Leo, staring up at the light. It was a miracle of wire and will. Maya cried. Frank clapped Leo on the shoulder, a rare display of affection. Dorothy laughed, a sound she hadn't made in months. It felt rusty, but real. The light and the warmth and the safety of the firehouse were becoming a magnet for the lost and the broken. It was the start of something new, built from the rubble of their old lives. It wasn't a charity. It was a system. Everyone contributed. Everyone worked. Frank built the shelter. Maya helped with domestic order. Leo brought light and, eventually, rudimentary internet through a hotspot. A new ecosystem was forming within the brick walls. If you made it this far, maybe you see a little bit of Frank and Dorothy's resilience in someone you know. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in the power of starting over. And let me know in the comments, what skill would you bring to the firehouse? The third person to arrive was Samuel. He was an old man, even older than Frank, a retired plumber who had lost his home to his late wife's medical bills. He was living in his car, proud and stubborn, but winter was setting in. He heard about the firehouse from Earl at the hardware store. He showed up one day with his toolbox, offering his skills in exchange for a warm place to sleep. With Samuel's arrival, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. He looked at the ancient, corroded pipes and saw not a hopeless mess, but a system waiting to be resurrected. Working with Frank, they began the monumental task of restoring the plumbing. They ran new PX tubing, bypassing the old, leaky copper. Samuel, with a plumber's magic, managed to get a single toilet and a sink functional in an old washroom. The first time they heard the sound of running water from a tap, it was as miraculous as the lights turning on. They had heat. They had light. They had sanitation. They had shelter. In the space of 3 months, they had gone from homeless to home builders. The firehouse was no longer a ruin. It was a homestead, a burgeoning, unlikely community. The rooms Frank built were small and simple, but they were clean and solid. He built one for Maya, with a space for a crib. He built one for Leo. He built one for Samuel. Each room was a testament to his skill and their collective will. The cavernous main bay was now their common area, warmed by the stove, lit by Leo's string of lights. They ate their meals together at a long table Frank had built from salvaged planks. The firehouse was becoming a living thing, its brick and mortar animated by the small band of outcasts who called it home. But living things attract attention, and not all of it is welcome. The threat arrived in a pristine, white county vehicle. A man in a crisp uniform with a clipboard under his arm stepped out. He walked with an air of unassailable authority. He didn't knock. He pushed open the main door and stood there, his eyes scanning the scene within. He saw the wood stove, the partition rooms, the string of lights, the small group of people huddled near the warmth. He saw home, but his clipboard told him he was seeing something else entirely. "I'm Arthur Henderson, from County Code Enforcement," he announced, his voice devoid of warmth. "I'm here in response to an anonymous complaint." Dorothy's heart sank. An anonymous complaint. She could guess the source. A disgruntled neighbor? Or someone more familiar? Someone embarrassed by the spectacle his parents were making of themselves? The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. Henderson began his inspection immediately. He walked through the space, making sharp, decisive notes on his clipboard. He noted the unpermitted construction of the rooms. He noted the residential use of a building zoned for municipal services. He measured the distance between the stove and the nearest wall. He looked at Samuel's plumbing work and Leo's wiring with a disdainful eye. He did not see a sanctuary. He saw a list of violations. "This is an illegal multi-family dwelling," he declared, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "The construction is unpermitted. The electrical and plumbing work has not been inspected. The building is not zoned for this occupancy." Frank stepped forward. "We're just trying to stay warm. We have nowhere else to go." Henderson's expression did not soften. He was a man of the book, and this situation was not in it. "Sir, my job isn't to evaluate your circumstances. My job is to enforce the county building code. And this," he said, gesturing around the room, "is a public safety hazard." He tore a sheet from his clipboard. It was a bright orange notice. He strode to the main door and taped it to the metal. "Condemnation notice." The words were a death sentence. "You have 30 days, Henderson said, turning back to face them, his face impassive. 30 days to either bring this entire structure up to full residential code, which, I assure you, is impossible, or to vacate the premises. At the end of 30 days, if you are still here, the county will have you removed and the building will be sealed. Permanently." He didn't wait for a response. He turned, walked out the door, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in his wake. The orange notice on the door seemed to pulse with a malevolent light. 30 days. It had taken them 3 months of relentless work to get this far, to achieve the bare minimum of habitability. Bringing the entire, massive building up to modern code in a month was a task for a commercial construction crew with $1 million budget, not a handful of outcasts with a line of credit at the hardware store. Despair, which had been held at bay for months, came flooding back in. Maya began to cry, silently. Leo stared at the notice, his face ashen. Samuel sank onto a bench, looking defeated for the first time. Frank just stood there, his fists clenched, staring at the orange paper. He was a builder, but this was a problem he couldn't solve with a hammer and nails. This was a battle against a system, against a man with a clipboard and the full weight of the county behind him. Dorothy felt the old, familiar coldness creep back into her bones. They had built this. They had clawed their way back from nothing. And now, a man with a pen was going to wipe it all away. Again. The news of the condemnation notice spread through the town like a winter chill. It started at Hobbs Hardware. Frank went there the next day, not to get supplies, but to tell Earl that he wouldn't be able to pay off his credit anytime soon. He explained what had happened. Earl Hobbs listened, his face growing darker with every word. When Frank was finished, Earl slammed his hand down on the counter, rattling a display of paint cans. "Henderson," he spat, the name like a curse. "That man would write his own grandmother a ticket for a crooked fence post. He follows the book so close he's forgotten how to read. Earl wasn't a man for sympathy. He was a man for action. While Frank stood there, Earl picked up the phone. Jim? Earl Hobbs. Yeah, I'm good. Listen, you still got your master electrician's license? Good. I need a favor. He made 3 more calls. To a retired master plumber. To a structural engineer he played poker with. To a mason whose family had been buying from the Hobbs family for 3 generations. He didn't ask for help. He called in favors. He spoke the language of tradesmen, a language of mutual respect and obligation. The next morning, a pickup truck pulled up to the firehouse. It was Jim, the electrician. He was a wiry man in his late 60s with a no-nonsense attitude. He looked at Leo's wiring. Not bad for a kid, he grunted. But we're going to do it right. An hour later, the plumber arrived. Then the mason. They weren't volunteers. They were a crew. Earl had told them the story. He had framed it not as charity, but as a fight. A fight against a bureaucratic bully who was trying to kick an old carpenter and his family out into the cold. The firehouse was suddenly transformed into a whirlwind of activity. The retired tradesmen, their skills dormant for years, came alive. They swarmed the building, their movements efficient and precise. Jim and Leo worked side by side, pulling new, properly gauged wire through conduit. The plumber, with Samuel as his apprentice, installed new shut-off valves and proper venting. The mason inspected the brickwork, identifying and repairing a few load-bearing areas that needed repointing. The community rallied in other ways. The pastor from a local church, hearing the news, announced an emergency bake sale and fundraiser. The women of the church auxiliary descended on the firehouse with mops and buckets, scrubbing decades of grime from the floors and walls. The high school football team showed up one Saturday and spent the day hauling debris out of the second floor, clearing it for the first time in 30 years. People who had dropped off blankets now dropped off money. A $20 bill tucked into Dorothy's hand. A 50 left anonymously on the table. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, meticulously recorded every single donation. The income column of her ledger was no longer just about kindness. It was about cash. Enough to pay Earl for the mountain of materials the new crew was going through. In the midst of this chaotic, hopeful storm, a sleek, dark gray sedan pulled up out front. A man in an expensive suit got out. It was Mark. He had heard about the Firehouse project from a former high school classmate. He had heard about the condemnation notice. He had come not out of concern, but out of a deep, seething embarrassment. He walked into the main bay, stepping around a coil of electrical wire, his polished shoes instantly coated in a fine layer of dust. He took in the scene. The flurry of work, the unfamiliar faces, his parents in the middle of it all, looking tired but determined. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. "What in God's name are you doing?" Frank stopped what he was doing, a hammer in his hand. Dorothy stepped forward, placing herself between her husband and her son. "We're saving our home," she said, her voice calm. "This is not a home," Mark hissed, his voice low so the others couldn't hear. "This is a public spectacle. You're the talk of the town, living in a ruin with a bunch of strays. I gave you a perfectly good place to live. A clean, respectable apartment." The lie was so bald, so audacious, that Dorothy felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The final column in her mental ledger on Mark had just been tallied. "You gave us an apartment for 1 month, Mark," she said, her voice level, factual. "You took our home. You took our car. You took our money. You left us with nothing." "I was protecting the asset," he insisted, his face flushing. "The house needed to be sold. It was the financially prudent thing to do." "Was it financially prudent to make your parents homeless?" she asked, the question a shard of ice. He had no answer for that. He just stared at her, his jaw working. He saw no remorse in her eyes. No shame, only a quiet, unyielding strength he did not recognize. "I came here to help," he said, changing tactics. "I can talk to the county. I have connections. I can smooth this over. But you have to stop this. This circus. You have to move into a proper facility. I'll even help pay for it." The offer was an insult. He wasn't offering help. He was offering to hide them again, to make his embarrassment go away. No, Dorothy said. The word was small, but it filled the cavernous space. No, he repeated, incredulous. This is our home now, she said, gesturing to the people working around them. These are our people. We are not leaving. She looked him directly in the eye, the bookkeeper delivering the final, brutal accounting. You should go, Mark. He stood there for a long moment, stunned. He had expected tears. He had expected recriminations. He had expected to be able to manage them, to control them with a mix of guilt and money. He was not prepared for this quiet, absolute rejection. He turned and walked out of the firehouse without another word. As he drove away, Dorothy did not watch him go. She turned back to the work. There were 22 days left. The final week was a blur of frantic, focused effort. The firehouse hummed with the sounds of saws, drills, and quiet, expert collaboration. The small band of outcasts and the crew of retired tradesmen had become a single, efficient unit. They had a shared enemy, the calendar, and a shared goal, to beat the man with the clipboard. On the 30th day, they were as ready as they could be. The wiring was not just functional. It was immaculate, all neatly run through conduit and terminated in new junction boxes, all done to Jim's exacting standards. The plumbing was sound, with new fixtures and no leaks. The rooms Frank had built were reinforced, with proper headers over the doors and windows. They had installed smoke detectors and fire extinguishers. The place was not just habitable, it was safe. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the white county vehicle pulled up. Arthur Henderson got out, his face as impassive as ever. He held a new clipboard. This time, he was not alone. The town's fire marshal was with him. Frank, Dorothy, Maya, Leo, Samuel, and the entire crew of retired tradesmen were gathered in the main bay. They stood in silence as Henderson and the fire marshal entered. The air was thick with tension. The 30-day period has expired, Henderson announced. We are here to conduct the final inspection. It began. It was a slow, methodical, nerve-wracking process. Henderson and the fire marshal moved through the building, room by room, checking every detail. They started with the electrical panel. Jim, the electrician, stood beside them, silently pointing out the new breakers, the grounding wire, the clean connections. Henderson made a note. No comment. They moved to the plumbing. The plumber was there, explaining the new PX lines, the proper venting. They flushed the toilet. They ran the sink. Henderson made another note. They inspected Frank's construction. The fire marshal thumped a wall. He checked the stability of the window frames. He measured the width of the doorways. They spent nearly 2 hours combing over every inch of the work. For the residents of the firehouse, it was torture. Every scratch of Henderson's pen on his clipboard felt like a judgment. They had poured their hearts, their skills, and the town's goodwill into this building. It was all coming down to this. Finally, Henderson and the fire marshal returned to the main bay. They stood in the center of the room, conferring in low voices. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Henderson looked up. He scanned the faces of the people watching him. The old carpenter, the determined bookkeeper, the pregnant girl, the outcast boy, the retired plumber, the crew of old-timers who had refused to let them fail. He clicked his pen. Well, he said, his voice flat. He paused, and in that pause, 100 futures hung in the balance. This isn't a firehouse anymore, he said slowly, looking around the transformed space. It's an apartment building. He looked directly at Frank. A rather unorthodox one. But the wiring is up to code. The plumbing is up to code. The structures are sound. You have proper fire suppression and egress. He tore the orange condemnation notice off the door. He folded it neatly and put it in his pocket. Then he took a fresh form from his clipboard. He started to fill it out. I'm issuing a temporary certificate of occupancy, he said, not looking at them, contingent on a final architectural review for rezoning, which I will recommend for approval. You've met the requirements. A collective breath was released. It was a quiet, shaky sigh of profound relief. Maya grabbed Dorothy's arm. Leo let out a whoop of joy. Henderson finished writing, signed the certificate with a flourish, and handed it to Dorothy. His face, for the first time, showed a flicker of something other than bureaucratic indifference. It might have been respect. "Ma'am," he said, "you have a home." He and the fire marshal turned and left. They had won. The aftermath was swift and unexpected. A reporter for the local paper, who had been following the story of the Firehouse family, wrote a feature piece. It was a simple, honest story about a community that had refused to be broken. But in the age of the internet, simple, honest stories can travel. The article was picked up by a regional news aggregator, then a national one. The story of the elderly couple betrayed by their children and saved by a derelict building and a town's compassion went viral. For Mark, the consequences were devastating. His name wasn't mentioned in the article, but in a small town, anonymity is a fiction. Everyone knew. His carefully constructed professional image, the foundation of his career in the city, crumbled. He was the man who had kicked his own parents out of their home. The fallout was quiet but complete. For Susan, the public story was a mirror she could not avoid. A week after the article ran, a priority mail envelope arrived at the Firehouse. It contained a cashier's check for $50,000 and a short, tear-stained letter. It was a torrent of guilt, regret, and self-loathing. "I'm so sorry," it said over and over. "I never should have listened to him." Dorothy looked at the check. It was a fortune. It was a fraction of what the house on Maple Street had been worth. She endorsed it, and the next day, she and Frank walked into Hobbs Hardware. She handed the check to Earl. "This should cover our bill," she said. Earl looked at the amount. It was far more than they owed. He tried to give it back. "No, Dorothy insisted. The rest is for the next person who comes to you with a leak to fix and nothing in their pocket. Consider it a professional courtesy." With the temporary certificate of occupancy, the Firehouse was no longer a squat. It was a legitimate, if unconventional, cooperative. The pressure was off. The frantic pace of survival slowed to the gentle, steady rhythm of life. They planted a garden. In the wide, empty lot behind the Firehouse where engines were once washed, they tilled the soil. Frank built raised beds. Samuel figured out an irrigation system. Everyone had a plot. Maya planted tomatoes. Leo, surprisingly, had a knack for herbs. Dorothy planted zinnias, a splash of defiant color against the old brick. The garden became a symbol of their new reality, a place of sustenance and growth, rooted in what had once been barren ground. Life settled into a new normal. Frank spent his days in the second-floor space they had cleared, setting up a magnificent workshop with tools donated by people in the town. He wasn't just fixing things anymore. He was creating. He built a beautiful, sturdy crib for Maya's baby. He built a proper desk for Leo. He built rocking chairs for the common area. Leo got a job. Jim, the retired electrician, took him on as a full-time apprentice. "Kid's a natural," he'd told Frank. Samuel held court in the washroom, teaching Leo and Maya how to fix a leaky faucet, passing on his knowledge. The Firehouse was no longer just a shelter for the lost. It was an incubator of purpose. One cool summer evening, a car they didn't recognize pulled up. A woman got out. It was Susan. She looked thinner, her face etched with a sorrow that was no longer hidden behind a bright, false smile. She just stood on the concrete apron, looking at the Firehouse, at the lights shining from the windows, at the smoke curling from the chimney. Dorothy walked out to meet her. They stood in silence for a long moment. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Susan whispered, her voice breaking. She didn't make excuses. She didn't blame Mark. She just stood there and owned her part in the devastation. "I was weak, and I was greedy, and I'm so sorry." Dorothy looked at her daughter, the child she had raised, the woman who had broken her heart. She thought of the beige apartment, the cold nights in the car. She thought of the terror and the shame. Forgiveness was a complex, tangled thing, not a simple transaction. But then she looked back at the Firehouse. She saw Frank through the window, sitting in one of his rocking chairs, talking with Samuel. She heard Maya's laughter from the kitchen. This place, this life, had been born from that wound. It did not erase the scar, but it had created something powerful in its place. She looked back at her weeping daughter. She didn't offer an embrace. She didn't say, "I forgive you." The words weren't there yet. Instead, She gestured toward the wide-open bay doors, where the light and the sounds of their new life spilled out into the evening. "The door's open," she said. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not an absolution. It was a beginning, a chance. Susan took a hesitant step forward, then another, and walked into the home her parents had built without her. Mark never came back. The party was the town's idea. A 1-year anniversary of the day, the old couple bought the ruin for $1. A celebration of the Firehouse family. They called it the Founders' Day Barbecue, and the name stuck. Frank and Dorothy sat on a bench near the garden, a bench Frank had built from the salvaged wood of a church pew. They watched the scene unfold. The whole town, it seemed, was there. The firehouse was the center of it all, its big red doors, which Frank had lovingly restored and painted, thrown wide open. Maya, due any day now, sat fanning herself, chatting with the pastor's wife. Her baby would be born into this community, loved and protected. Leo was proudly showing off the new outdoor speakers he had wired, a playlist of old soul music drifting through the air. Samuel was arguing good-naturedly with Earl Hobbs about the best way to grow tomatoes. Dorothy looked at her husband. He was watching the crowd, a small, quiet smile on his face. He looked 10 years younger than he had on that terrible day a year ago. The builder had been given something to build, and in doing so, he had rebuilt himself. On the windowsill of their small, ground-floor room, just behind the bench, sat a small, framed photograph. It was a picture of her and Frank from 1967 on their wedding day. They were impossibly young, standing in front of a half-finished house on Maple Street, their faces bright with the unwritten future. Dorothy looked from the young couple in the photo to the old man sitting beside her, his gnarled, capable hands resting on his knees. She thought of the ledger she still kept. It was no longer a book of desperate accounting. It was a record of a thriving, bustling, unconventional household. The columns were balanced. The bottom line was profoundly, miraculously in the black. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the garden. The lights Leo had strung overhead twinkled against the deepening twilight. The firehouse stood behind them, solid and warm, a beacon of brick and light. Frank's hand found hers, the familiar, comforting weight of it a silent testament to everything they had endured and everything they had become. He had built them a home again, and this time its foundation was unshakable.